Hello, everybody. Good day. It's very early morning for me. It's evening for some of you. So good day to all of you. Welcome to the Informal Asia-Pacific Regional Science Policy Dialogue on DSI. My name is Lily Weisgold, and I work for an organization called Meridian Institute, which convenes informal meetings on DSI, among other topics. I'm pleased to be here with all of you today for this webinar, which is jointly convened by Meridian, the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, and the Indonesian National Research and Innovation Agency. You'll hear more about the genesis of this meeting in a few minutes, but first I wanted to turn to, next slide, please. Doctors Amir Hamidi and Hartmut Meyer. First, I'll turn to Dr. Hamidi, who is the director of the Secretariat for the Scientific Authority for Biodiversity at the Indonesian National Research and Innovation Agency. Dr. Hamidi, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Lily. I would distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good mornings and good day and good evenings. Welcome to this important webinar on the topic of the digital sequence information and its implication for benefit sharing under the CBD. As the representative of our respective nations, we are all acutely aware of biodiversity's critical role in the well-being of our planet and the people. However, as we navigate the complexities of the digital age, the issue surrounding DSI presents both challenge and opportunities, particularly in the context of fair and equitable benefit sharing. For Indonesia, the issue of DSI goes beyond the mere access to genetic resources. It is about the ensuring fairness, equity, and sustainable use of biodiversity. As we engage in this discussion, it is imperative that we focus on the practical solutions rather than adding layer of complexity to an already challenging issue in the documents. One of the key issues that must be addressed is the establishment of a clear mechanism, multilateral mechanism. This mechanism is crucial to ensure that the benefit derived from the use of DSI are shared equitably, particularly with the developing countries and indigenous people and local communities, who are often the steward of the biodiversity from which the sequence are derived. Indonesia strongly advocates for the system that are not only facilitate benefit sharing, but also support conservation and sustainable use of the biodiversity globally. In addition, we must work toward a much clearer definitions of DSI, particularly in the term of the criteria that distinguish DSI products. The clarity is essential to avoid ambiguities that could hinder the effectiveness implementations of the benefit sharing agreement. We also need to define mechanism by which benefits are distributed, ensuring that they support both scientific advancement and the need of the countries in managing the biodiversity. As we prepare for the COP16 in Cali, Colombia, we must focus our effort on resolving this issue rather than introducing additional complexities into the negotiations. Indonesia is committed to working collaboratively toward a consensus reflecting equity, fairness, and shared responsibility. We believe that with a concerted effort, we can develop a framework that addresses the concern of all parties involved and paves the way for a sustainable future. In closing, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to all speakers who have graciously agreed to share their insight today. Your expertise is invaluable as we navigate this complex issue. I also extend my heartfelt thanks to entire organizing committee, the Meridian Institute and team, for your hard work and dedications in making these events possible. To the audience, I welcome you all and hope this webinar can further increase our understanding of the real issue circulating in DSI. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Dr. Hamidi, and for your remarks on the importance of the multilateral mechanism and sort of the road that everybody needs to take to COP16. Next, I'll turn to Hartmut Meyer to give a welcome from the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. Hartmut, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So I hope also that my video is clear and I don't have a problem here with my video connections. I'd like to welcome all of you to this Asia-Pacific Science Policy Dialogue. My name is Hartmut Meyer. I work for the ABS Capacity Development Initiative and together with the Meridian Institute and the BRIN, we organized this webinar. I think we are at a very crucial step in the CBD negotiations on digital sequence information. As we know, the COP is ahead of us, and we'll discuss the modalities of a future benefit sharing system for the use of DSI. And I think the expectations are very high that there will be a positive outcome, and also that the system which will be built is in the end an effective system and can promise the financial resources which are definitely needed for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. The ABS initiative was active in conducting several events on DSI, several workshops, several webinars in the last years. And what we can say also when participating at the last DSI negotiations in Montreal is that the discussions are usually very well founded. The participants, the negotiators are well informed about the topics. And so I think that all this work the various institutions brought into building capacity around the DSI topics, I think it will bear fruits, and I'm very confident that also this webinar, which will bring together actually scientists and users from the public and the private sectors with the negotiators, will contribute to a deeper understanding of all issues. Because in the end, we need to see that the CBD will negotiate and adopt a very new system, and it's a very new concept behind that system, that we don't only regulate access and benefit sharing for the use of the material part of biodiversity, but now we would also include the immaterial parts, the information on genetic resources in this global system of benefit sharing. Well, with that, I like to stop my introduction, and I wish you all a very informative event, and give back to Lily.
Thank you very much for that, Hartmut. You laid out a lot of what we'll be discussing later in this webinar together. So next slide, please. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm going to run through some technical specifics and then our agenda for today, as well as some background information about the informal process on DSI to date. And then we'll really get down to the discussion via some input presentations and then some panels. So as you can probably see, the chat's going to be open throughout the webinar. However, the organizing team would please ask that you send chat messages to everybody. That's going to require you selecting everyone rather than simply hosts and panelists. We will be reading and monitoring the chat throughout this meeting and compiling questions to pose to the panels. A note on the presentations that you're going to hear, you'll hear several input presentations. There won't be time for question and answer after those. However, if you have questions about the presentations, please do put them in the chat. We'll aggregate them and try as best we can to address them in the post-meeting report. Next slide, please. So I'll run through the agenda briefly so we're all on the same page about what we're discussing today. You heard some wonderful welcoming remarks. I've gone through most of the technical introduction. We'll have a poll so we can quickly figure out who's in the room with us today. You'll hear 4 input presentations, one on the use of DSI, one on the importance of science and policy being in dialogue, an update on the DSI negotiation process from the Secretariat of the Convention of Biological Diversity, and then a presentation on remaining areas of agreement and disagreement to discuss before and during COP16. We'll then have a well-deserved break and then go into our panels, the first of which is a panel featuring scientific users of DSI, the second of which is a panel featuring policymakers and negotiators. Next slide, please. Then we'll have another brief break before we go into our final panel, which is the science and policy in dialogue. So all of our panelists from the earlier panels will come and speak with each other. We'll have a brief wrap up and goodbyes, and then the end of the session. So just to provide some background information on ABS Capacity Development Initiative and Meridian's joint informal work on DSI that led us to today. From 2019 to December of 2022, the government of Norway co-funded the first phase of ABS Capacity Development Initiative's work on DSI in the run-up to COP15. In November of 2023, at the first open-ended working group on DSI, there was new funding for an informal work announced, including Meridian Institute and ABS Capacity Development Initiative. In December of 2023, a call for suggestions from national focal points went out for the informal process. We used the feedback from that call to generate our work plan through COP16. This meeting is one of the things that we heard that national focal points desired. And then from January of this year to the present, the informal process has been ongoing. A note on the informal work, it's distinct from yet builds upon the informal advisory group, and it builds on the formal negotiation process and the open-ended working groups as well. The activities that we're jointly undertaking are intended to help inform and enable progress in the formal negotiation process with the goal of fulfilling the mandate set out in Decision 15.9 from COP15. As a note, there have been 2 other regional science policy dialogues that took place earlier this year. The purpose of the science policy dialogues is to encourage exchange between users/scientists of DSI and policymakers. You'll hear more about the importance of this during a later presentation. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my colleague Allison to share the poll. It'll be up for about 30 seconds. Great if you could answer the 2 questions, just so we can get a better idea of who's in the room with us today. Thank you all for participating. From my end, at least from the back end, it looks like we have a lot of policymakers and negotiators and a lot of academic scientists, as well as some representatives or members of indigenous nations who represent indigenous peoples and local communities. So Ali, I'm going to ask you to close the poll for now. The output of this will be in the report from this meeting. So now I'm going to turn it back to my colleague Hartmut Meyer to give a presentation about the use of DSI. Hartmut, take it away.
Can we go back? Yes. Well, it's an explanation about the quite complex, what we call world of DSI. And I think those of you who have followed the issue, the topic since some time, know that we will have more or less like 2 systems. Of course, we have the bilateral ABS system set up under the Nagoya Protocol, and we are going to have a multilateral system for benefit sharing for DSI specifically under the CBD and potentially also under other UN fora. So usually everything starts with access to genetic resources, as you see in that, where you go to a certain country of origin to get that resource. Just click next one. And then if the country has an ABS framework, there need to be an agreement and an ABS contract, which we call PIC and MAT. And those documents then will specify the details of access and also of use and benefit sharing. Next one, please. Can you click? And another time. Okay, so, and then of course, as we know, after access, there usually is research and development with these genetic resources, and in many cases, also what we call the sequence information on certain biological molecules like DNA, RNA, and protein is revealed, is established in this research, and so sequence information is available at this first user, and usually, and please click again, this information is then uploaded into international open access data banks. Well, that's the first part of the study that under AMAT, then benefit sharing was agreed and will come back to the country of origin. Sorry, but with DSI, now we add an additional layer, and please click again. So this information, and once time again, this information is actually then uploaded to data banks, where most of the DSI which is present in these data banks until now has no country of origin tag. Meanwhile, it is mandatory, so if you upload sequence information, you also need to say in which country the genetic resource was originally sourced. And can you click again? And what also is not possible is, of course, to upload the respective ABS contract with the sequence information, and that also would be, let's say, of no bigger use, because that contract is signed between the provider and the first user, and anybody else then using DSI from these data banks is not bound to that ABS contract any longer. Can you then click again? So then now we enter, let's say, the relationship between the provider and the first user. These data banks provide open access, and that is also something the CB negotiations won't change. I think that has been established now. So every need be researchers, we can access these data banks and download or use these data. The main difference to the usual bilateral access is that here thousands of accessions can be downloaded, or the data bank is calculating for the researcher using millions of entries. So the whole data set as such is used in research and development. And please click again. Yeah, again, of course, now this sequence information can be used in commercial and non-commercial use and research. And what is adding another level of complexity, and that is also something we actually need to deal with in the negotiation, is that based on all the information, on all these biological information and knowledge, of course, now with the help of artificial intelligence and very sophisticated computer programs, new DSI can be created without the use of the genetic resources. So that is something which we need to deal. So this DSI comes, let's say, is created by algorithms, but still is, of course, based on the vast knowledge of biology which has been created in the last decades. That DSI can also be uploaded to data banks and used by others again. So then if you can click again. And as I said, this research and development and also commercial developments based on the use of sequence information is not under any benefit sharing agreements today. And that was the concern of many developing countries, actually, that the benefits arising from this kind of use are not shared with them. And please click again. So it's very clear, and one time again. So then I hope I was able to explain these two different worlds. On the left side, the national access, the bilateral model. On the right side, the multilateral model with open access data banks. And what the CBD has decided in 22 was that on the right side, that this box on the right side should also come under a benefit sharing system. And until now, we have like 2 international fora decided. So it's the CBD and the UNCLOS agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So that is just for introduction. Please click again. And of course, this, let's say this sounds all very, very scientific. And you might wonder what is the relationship to the CBD actually and to the global biodiversity framework. And I'm just going to borrow presentations which were held before in the context of the science policy dialogues here. The one for the CRULA countries, can you click the next one? There had been very interesting presentations on the connection to the GBF by Michelle Hammer and co-researchers from South Africa actually, and the DSI Scientific Network. And click again. And they actually looked into what the use of DSI can contribute to the various tasks we have in biodiversity-related policies in action under the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I'm not going into details here, but you can see that in many kinds of activities, actually sequencing of DNA, etc., is meanwhile methodology that is broadly used. So in assessment of biodiversity, of course, like taxonomies and others rely on DSI use, modeling of ecosystems and of populations, and spatial planning can make use of DNA data. Of course, monitoring and restoration of biodiversity is also something where scientists need to look into what kind of organisms are we monitoring, what kind of organisms are we using to restore biodiversity, etc. So now I also want to underline the forensic investigation. A lot of illegal trade with like fish or whatever is done, and here the method of choice is that like say fish meat on markets are actually analyzed and then compared with the DNA stored in these data banks to see whether the herring actually is a herring or whether meat might come from sharks or other protected species. So there is a vast vast array of activity that actually rely on DSI in all our biodiversity activities and policies. Please, the next. The next slide. And then the authors just draw the, oops, when you go back again. The authors drew this nice picture of having all the goals of the GBF and then evaluating how DSI is related to them. Of course, the yellow ones are where DSI is actually part of the goal, more or less. Goal 13, of course, but also the goal on scientific cooperation. And others are very much dependent on the use of DSI. I only want to go to, on the left side, to goal number 17, which is the goal on biosafety. Of course, there DSI is a crucial element of any kind of policies, monitoring, etc. So that's I think also came to a bit of surprise of many people how DSI is actually important to reach a lot of the goals of the GBF. So next one, please. And I think the last short presentation is about the role of artificial intelligence in our discussion, which is also called the future proofing of a DSI mechanism. So we know that artificial intelligence is used to create DSI, and that DSI will be used also to create benefits, and it should be captured in a multilateral mechanism. We shouldn't run into a situation where we exclude foreseeable future developments from a benefit sharing mechanism. And here I want to use the presentation of Amber Scholz, also from that GRULAC Policy Science Dialogue. And please go ahead on the next slide. Which is just giving a very brief overview about a recent development, that is how you can predict protein structures with artificial intelligence, and what is the scientific significance of that, and also might be a commercial significance in future. And so we know that we know protein structures, and these protein structures are stored in specific data banks, and we also know a lot of relationship of structures to certain characteristics of proteins. And so, for example, it would be possible in future, or even now, that a protein of interest is there and it should be used in an industrial process, but it needs to be heat resistant. And the protein at hand comes from an organism that lives in ambient temperature, but there are some characteristics in proteins which make them heat resistant. And so with artificial intelligence, with the algorithms behind that, new proteins are used, and they might then also be used in future products. So that is I think everyday life of science meanwhile. And please click on the last picture. And these were the take-home messages of that presentation. Also here is that there need to be a broad definition of DSI in the end, or DSI products, so that we are able to capture also future uses of DSI, and they are already foreseeable, so it's not something which we can't think about. And the benefit sharing mechanism really needs to be designed to capture all users of DSI, and that is, I think, the main message of this presentation. Of course, we are with artificial intelligence. We are at the beginning of that development, especially when we look into the commercial use and products. But of course, I think it is inevitable that here a large use in the future, also within the commercial world, will happen. So with that, I like to end this presentation on the various aspects on DSI and the interlinkage between the science and the policy side of all the discussions. So thanks, Lily.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Hartmut. I at least always find it interesting to think about both the uses of DSI, as well as how DSI can be useful to achieving the goals set out in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Pierre Duplessis to give a presentation about the history and importance of science and policy and dialogue, the technical introduction of DSI from scientific and policy angles. So Pierre, go ahead and take yourself off mute and turn your camera on.
Thank you, Lily. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Well, obviously, because DSI is a very scientific issue, and we are making policy about how to share the benefits from its use, it's really important that the policymakers and the scientists talk to each other. The next slide, please. And I think for the policymakers from the scientific side, it's really important to understand that genetics really is all about comparing different genomes. So to get useful information, you need a big data set. The bigger that background data set is that is available to everyone, the more useful it is for everyone. Of course, individual sequences that encode valuable mutations are often the source of commercial development. But to identify those, everyone who uses DSI needs a big data set for comparison. And because that data set is so big and is growing so rapidly, becoming bigger and bigger, tracking and tracing of those sequences that are used for comparison and even used for development is a very difficult thing to do technically. And even if it was possible technically, would probably not improve the outcomes for benefit sharing. And so from the beginning, when we started discussing DSI in 2016 in Cancun at COP13, one of the overwhelming responses from the science community is, please don't burden us with red tape and bureaucracy, because that is going to slow us down. It's going to stop us from doing the useful work that we want to do. And it's really not what we are there for. We've got PhDs, we've got expensive laboratories, and we should not be spending our time filling in forms. I think it's also important to realize that in the text of the CBD, there's no legal basis and no realistic prospect of establishing a legal basis for controlling or restricting access to sequences that are already publicly available. Of course, it is agreed that under the sovereign right of countries, you can restrict the use of DSI in mutually agreed terms from any new access that you provide. And this is in fact common practice in the private sector, that not only don't they share their proprietary sequences, they in fact refuse to tell us even what they have in those collections. And next slide, please. One of the things that we really should bear in mind when we consider this is that the current open access infrastructure globally consists of the International Nucleotide Sequence Database collaboration with 3 databases, one in the United States, one in Europe, based in the UK, and one in Japan. And each of these databases have specialized tools and sections for scientists to use free of charge, open access, anonymously. Now, next slide, please. Those 3 databases exchange their information every, go back, please. Yeah, Ben, thank you. Those 3 databases, every 24 hours, they exchange all their information. So anything that's uploaded into any one of these databases is available on the other 2 the next day. And of course, the elephant in the room here is that the US is not a party to the CBD, and GenBank, which is based in the US, is the main, or the busiest of these 3 databases. So anything that is uploaded anywhere will be available without any of the rules that the CBD agrees from the US leg of the collaboration the next day. Also important to bear in mind that this costs a lot of money to maintain. This figure of $50 million a year, in fact, if you count all of the extensions and specialized tools that are supported, probably about $150 million a year. And at the moment, there's no registration, and as I said, the US leg is outside of the CBD. Next slide, please. Just a quick look here at the policy of the INSTC, which dates from 2002. It's based on unrestricted free access. There will be no statements that will restrict the access. There will be no use restrictions or licensing requirements. The database records will remain permanently accessible as part of the scientific record, and the information is fully disclosed to the public. So that is the policy at the moment, and there's very little indication that there's any interest in changing that Although, of course, 2002 is a long time ago. The science has evolved a lot since then, and things might change. Next slide, please. The reason that scientists put their information into an open access database is for purposes of comparison, because individual sequence is meaningless unless you can compare it. It's also because of a policy that that scientific journals will not publish papers unless the data is openly available to other scientists to check the research outcomes. Making the data available is often a requirement for getting research funding. And then, of course, ethical issues around scientific reproducibility, integrity, and data security that need to be considered. Next slide, please. Another thing that is interesting to observe is that most scientists actually use sequences that come from their own territories or their own regions. Now, that slide we skipped over, but this one here shows just how complicated the use of DSI is, how many different aspects are involved, and potentially open up new understanding by identifying new connections in how biology functions at a fundamental level. And the more this understanding grows, of course, the more benefits are available to be shared. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Just to give you an idea of the, sorry, go back. To give you an idea of the size of the DSI universe, there are the three main databases, and then there around them several thousand smaller secondary databases, more specialized, better curated, better cleaned up. But 99% of those databases are interconnected to the three main databases. And 55% of them focus on other types of data, which are not really DSI. This data infrastructure is paid for by the countries hosting the databases, and it's used by academia and industry. And then industry typically downloads the whole data set once a day over an FTP server and keeps that in-house and works with its proprietary sequences against that database, mainly because of concerns about corporate espionage, but also, of course, speed and access and bandwidth concerns and so on. Next slide, please. So this is just a little diagram that shows how interconnected this world is, right? These are just 19 of the thousands of databases, and this is a demonstration of the interlinkages between them. So you can see a very complicated situation. The permutations are mathematically astronomical. There's like huge number of connections possible, and very difficult to track that, and even more difficult once you have tracked that to say, well, this particular combination of sequences contributed to this particular product. Next slide, please. It's also important to bear in mind that the DSI world is moving very quickly. There's basically every day there's a new innovation. Most of the innovation happening in the health sector. That's also where, you know, single cell multiomics and artificial intelligence, etc., is like being developed, but then those technologies find their way into other sectors. There's also a really rapid advance in the ability to manipulate genetics at a molecular level, and therefore to design proteins from scratch. But this growth in the technology also represents an opportunity for technological leapfrogging by developing countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, Hartmut already showed you this, how artificial intelligence is now being used to create sequences that don't occur in nature. However, I would argue that they still use the fundamental building blocks of life, and therefore benefit sharing from those sequences should also be captured and used to protect biodiversity. Next slide, please. From a scientific side, it's also important to realize that recognition of for their work and credit for their work is really important for scientists in their career advancement. This publish or perish doctrine in academia. Right? And also that in developing countries, scientists need support through technology transfer of next generation sequencing equipment, but they also need reliable access to consumables. They need fast and reliable data connections. They need local bioinformatics services. And maybe most importantly, they do need to participate and learn from collaborative research networks and partnerships. So it's really important that the policy outcomes of this discussion do not destroy those international collaborations. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. From the policy angle, I think it's really important for policymakers to bear in mind that computers have fundamentally changed the world, and the DSI has fundamentally changed the utilization of genetic resources, and that this is a trend that is only just starting and will continue and speed up. The whole idea of ABS came out of a world that no longer exists. It's the post-colonial world of the Cold War, developing against developed countries, which is less and less relevant in the modern multipolar world. And that the third objective of the CBD, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from utilization, was understood when it was agreed, at least by developing countries, to be a driver of sustainable use, leading to good conservation outcomes. I think we can now conclude, after all of our experiences, that pairing benefit sharing with access in a bilateral system has proven to be dysfunctional. There's restrictions on access and there's complete lack of benefit sharing. And the reason for that is because there's simply too much free access available that is not controlled by countries and do not attract a benefit sharing obligation. So we really need to think outside the box and deal with that reality of free access, or which you can also call the issue of scope, right? And we need to address that, because unless we do that, benefit sharing will never play its intended role in the CBD, which is to mobilize resources for economic development based on the sustainable use of biological resources. And this is really where we have an opportunity now in agreeing the multilateral mechanism to fix this problem and to future-proof it comprehensively and holistically. Next slide, please. It's obvious in many ways that DSI is really important for achieving the SDGs and for sustainable development more generally in important areas like health, food security, biodiversity management, etc. And because of that, DSI is also very closely linked to things that are important to developing countries, like resource mobilization, capacity development, and technology transfer. And policymakers, especially from developing countries, have a duty to consider the impacts of DSI, of the multilateral mechanism, on traditional knowledge holders and farmers' rights. Right? You cannot ignore the rights that people have in resources just because it's a multilateral system. It needs to be addressed. So there's an urgent, and I want to underscore urgent, because this is something that is, there's a biodiversity crisis, and we need to deal with that. We need to mobilize resources for that rapidly. But we also need to develop a coordinated approach to this in all the different international instruments that are dealing with DSI, because currently there's a lot of confusion there because of an uncoordinated approach from countries to the various instruments and the various sectors. It's also important to reflect on the differences and similarities of the various sectors. And then finally, I think it is important to recognize that a deliberate and qualified and limited surrender of sovereign rights over DSI is required to create a functional multilateral mechanism. But this, of course, only applies to sequences that are legally and legitimately made publicly available in open access databases. Next slide, please. So, as you know, it's being dealt with in various different fora. I'm not going to go into the details of this, except to point out that unless we have a coordinated master plan, which is the CBD's work to do, because the CBD is the mothership of benefit sharing, we run the risk of fragmenting the world's DSI collection into separate subsets or silos, which science tells us will make it much more difficult to do all of the good things that DSI potentially enables us to do. So we really have to reflect on how much fragmentation can be tolerated before science becomes impacted negatively. Next slide, please. So really, considering that the COP is less than 2 months away, we need to find a simple solution, and it's urgent that we do so. Because one of the biggest risks to the future of DSI is that you have a proliferation of incompatible national systems until eventually scientists have to deal with potentially more than 100 different sets of rules. And this will really harm everyone. This will really restrict the ability, the use that we can make of digital sequence information. And a simple system needs to avoid confusion. It needs to avoid legal uncertainty. It needs to avoid unnecessary red tape. And that means that we need a simple system that is convincing to developing countries and other providers, and that very quickly generates very substantial benefits for biodiversity. We cannot go down a process path that takes years and years before there's a flow of money to conservation and sustainable use. It's also really important that the policymakers and negotiators listen to scientists and address the concerns, and also take note of what they say they can and can't do in practice. And the practical implication of the policy options that we choose from the options that are currently on the table after the Montreal meeting needs to be evaluated, especially as it concerns their monitoring, reporting, and enforcement. Many of the options, in my view, the options that are on the table will create a nightmare of monitoring and enforcement. It will basically move interest from the databases to the national authorities and make things very, very difficult, especially in low capacity developing countries. And then a final thought on it is that biodiversity is in crisis, and we have a $200 billion funding gap to fill. We need to do everything we can to make sure that DSI makes a substantial contribution to bridging that funding gap. So the importance of the science policy dialogue is that science needs to inform policy, and policy needs to be developed to support science. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for running a little bit over my allocated 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Pierre. And even though you ran over, we're right back on schedule for the webinar. Thank you for the considerations for both policymakers and scientists, and for reminding the room of the importance of future-proofing the system, the role of DSI for the Sustainable Development Goals, and the importance of coming to a simple solution soon. To the point of coming to a solution soon, we'd next like to turn to Charlotte Germain-Aubry from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, who will give a presentation on the process for the DSI negotiations following the second open-ended working group. So Charlotte, go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting the Secretariat to this DSI dialogue, very important regional dialogue. I'm delighted to be here with you all. So I'm going to talk about the point of view of the Secretariat, basically looking at the process on DSI that is currently ongoing, where we're at, what we've done so far, and how you can all get ready for the COP16, which seems like it's tomorrow, but you actually have until mid-October, a little bit later, in Colombia. So I won't go back more than the COP15. Basically, what we have as a basis for work is decision 15/9 on DSI from the COP15 in December 2022 here in Montreal. And I will just pick a few things that I think are more relevant, but I obviously invite you to read this decision very closely and consider every single paragraph as relevant and important, and as the basis of the work for the COP16. Anything in the decision 15/9 has been decided, so it's not something to reopen, but rather something to start from. So here we have, oops, sorry, I'll go back. The COP15 has agreed that the benefits from the use of DSI have to be fair, fairly, and equitably. Recognize also importantly that tracking and tracing of all DSI is not practical. I think the presentation by Pierre just now made it very clear why technically DSI is used in vast volumes at a very high rate, etc., for research and innovation. And so tracing it is not something we can consider at this point. There's also an agreement that the fair and equitable sharing of DSI does not affect existing rights and obligations under the convention and under the Nagoya Protocol. And that includes those rights and obligations related to traditional knowledge and the rights of indigenous people and local communities. And it is without prejudice to national access and benefit sharing measures currently in place. And I think that might touch to one of the questions in the chat that I saw before this presentation. Also, the COP decided to establish, as part of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of DSI, including a global fund. In terms of process, this decision also established a process which is fair, transparent, inclusive, and participatory, and also time-bound, because it has to end by COP16. And this process is to further develop and operationalize the mechanism, and including the global fund, right? So very tight timeline on moving forward with this new mechanism and taking advantage of the momentum that we have. This decision has paragraphs 9 and 10, which are very important, and we call them the principles of the mechanism, but they're basically a list of things that the parties agreed to very early on, actually before the COP15 and the intersessional work, and those principles really stuck and are the basis of all the discussion that is going on the operationalization of the global mechanism, to date, basically. So I'll just read them very quickly. The solution for the benefit sharing on DSI should, inter alia, be efficient, feasible, and practical, generate more benefits, including monetary and non-monetary, than costs, be effective, provide certainty and legal clarity for providers and for users of DSI. It should not hinder research and innovation. It should be consistent with open access to data. It cannot be incompatible with international legal obligations, and it has to be mutually supportive of other access and benefit sharing instruments. It should also take into account the rights of indigenous people and local communities, including with respect to the traditional knowledge associated with the genetic resources that they hold. And finally, the COP recognized that monetary and non-monetary benefits arising from the use of DSI should in particular be used to support conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity and inter alia benefit indigenous people and local communities. So I think you'll see that those principles are very simple, but they're very thorough. They actually mean a lot when we start thinking through various options on how to operationalize this mechanism. And they touch a lot on what presenters before me have talked about in terms of research, innovation, clarity, etc. So looking at the process to date, so we will start basically COP15 was at the very beginning of this line that you're seeing. And we had a mandate from the COP to the executive secretary to do a number of things. And so all these things have been done by now. So you can see we had a submission of views on mechanism on DSI, which we synthesized and we submitted to the first open-ended working group on DSI, WG DSI 1. You can see at the bottom of your screen here. We also had a compilation of lessons learned from other international funding mechanisms, which fed into the first meeting of the working group. And that happened in Geneva in November of last year. We also had from the COP15 some studies that were commissioned, that we were asked to commission. So one was on the value chain revenue point, and one was on modeling of policy options that were proposed to date. And that was done and fed into the second meeting of the working group. Also, you can see the sort of box at the bottom, which is intersessional activities. So those were not mandated by the COP15, the COP15 at its 15 meeting, but rather by the working group during the first meeting. And there was this chain of intersessional activities that were mandated for the second meeting of the working group. So all of this outcome of the first meeting, the intersessional activities and the studies fed into the second meeting of the working group, which we had 2 weeks ago here in Montreal. And the outcome of the second meeting of the working group is now feeding into the COP16, which will happen in October very soon. So this will be the basis of work for the COP, will be the outcome of this working group, basically. So here in a little bit more detail, we'll look at the official documents that I really invite you to read through and consult and think about and discuss with your stakeholders and with various ministries within your governments, which are concerned with those various areas of study. So in bold is basically the report of the working group at its second meeting. And that basically encompasses everything else after it was discussed by the parties and stakeholders, and after there were obvious areas of convergence and obvious areas that still needed to be discussed at COP16. So this will be the basis of the work in Cali, in Colombia, in October. You can see it's currently available as an L2 document. But once our editing team will have had time to process it, it will be available as document CBD/WGDSI/2/3. I also invite you to look a little bit more into where some of this outcome came from. And I'll just go quickly through the list of things from a reverse order in terms of timeline, right? So we have document from the second meeting. So the Add1 document is a reflection of the co-chairs on possible elements identified by the working group at its first meeting. And this is basically the co-chairs of the conference, the committee of the whole of the working group, which thought through everything that has come through and talk about their narrative leading up to some of the options that you can find in the outcome of the working group and that were discussed here in Montreal 2 weeks ago. You also have the report of the co-chairs on the outcome of their informal intersessional work. I'll touch on it at the next slide. But there was a lot of international work that was done. A lot of discussions happened. And it's very important for parties to come to COP16 being aware of what has already been discussed and what came out of it. So we can have very productive discussions at COP16. Time is very limited during a COP. So we want everybody to be caught up with everything that has been done in the past, in case you were not able to actually join the informal intercessional work. We had the studies, as I said, that were commissioned by the COP15. So we have document Add 2, Rev 1 is the executive summary of those studies. And then you have in information document 1, the full studies, which are very long, but actually include some very important parts where you can really build your knowledge on those topics. And now we go to the documents from the first meeting of the working group, where we have the executive summary of the compilation of lessons learned, which we commissioned as well from other international funding mechanism. And then in one document, you have the full compilation of lessons learned. Same thing. It's a long document, but some parts of it are very important in order to build your knowledge on what other mechanisms actually do and how they handle contributions and disbursement and governance and all these aspects that we are trying to decide for the multilateral mechanism on DSI. And then lastly, I invite you to look at the document Add 1 from the first meeting of the working group, which is the synthesis of views pursuant to decision /9. So what parties submitted to the Secretariat after the COP, it was in March of last year, so it's dating a little bit now. I think a lot of work has been done, but it's still interesting to see where parties and stakeholders are coming from on this topic. Now on to the informal advisory group, which was arguably the biggest, at least the heaviest part of the intercessional work between the first and the second meeting of the working group. You can see there's a link to a website that will actually go through all the topics, and you can look at the presentations that were given to the group by experts. And really hopefully benefit from all the work that was done in the most transparent way. So you can see that we had 7 meetings. We actually ended up adding a second one in the month of June. And lots of those meetings had, well, nearly all of them had 2 topics. Now, these topics come from the annex of decision 15/9 on areas that needed further work in order to be able to operationalize the mechanism. So all these topics have now been discussed in the presence of parties, non-parties, indigenous people and local communities, and stakeholders from various domains of industry and database and academia. And so the discussions were very rich in terms of points of views that were shared and exchanged. So I invite you to also look at this. The last slide I'll share is how you as a party can prepare for the 16th meeting of the Conference of the Parties in Cali. And so I'll say it again, the report of the second meeting of the working group will be the basis of the discussions at COP16. It is the most recent document that we have. And so it has everything that basically you will need to prepare for in terms of topics. I invite you to discuss with appropriate stakeholders, but also with various ministries in your governments to talk about modalities for the contributions of the fund, the disbursement of those funds, and that's for the global fund, the governance of the mechanism, the review of this mechanism, the involvement and the rights of indigenous people and local communities, and it should be another point, but the role of non-monetary benefits in the mechanism itself. As we can see, this can easily touch different ministries. We're thinking industry and finance, and research and innovation ministries, for education, etc. There's a lot of different topics that are being touched upon in this mechanism and in the decisions that will have to be made at the COP16. So it's important to prepare and to involve the whole of society in the preparation for this COP. Finally, I'll remind you of the mandate of the COP. It's very important to operationalize the multilateral mechanism, including the Global Fund. So the time for theoretical discussions and exploration, etc., is now over, and the time for decision making has arrived at COP15. And so the operationalization of the multilateral mechanism, it's too early for me to say that word, will have to happen at COP16. That is the mandate that was given to us. And with this, I will just remind for those who recall for those who were there, but share for those who were not there, of the spirit that is present in the negotiating room at DSI and the discussion room on DSI since the COP15, and actually before the COP16, the COP15 as well, which is a spirit of it's constructive, it's very ambitious, and it's very positive. The process has been transparent, inclusive, and very productive. And we're really hoping that and looking forward to finding that spirit again in the negotiating room at COP16 in Cali. So we look forward to seeing you there, and we are at your disposal to answer any questions or help you between now and Cali. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Charlotte. It was helpful to hear a bit about the background of Decision 15.9 and some of the documents that are available, as well as information on the road ahead to COP16. Just as a note to everybody, when you send questions in the chat, please make sure to send it to everybody in quotes rather than to hosts and panelists, so that the ABS Capacity Development Initiative can collate those comments behind the scenes. And as I said at the beginning, we're not going to have question and answers for these input presentations. We'll take your questions on them and we'll address them in the post-meeting report. With that, Ali, if you could reshare your screen, please. I will give the floor to my colleague Timothy Hodges to give our final input presentation, which is broadly about the areas where there's a bit of agreement and the areas where there's a need for further discussion at COP16. So without further ado, please go ahead, Tim.
Thank you very much, Lily. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you here today. Next slide, please. I'm aware that we're running a little bit behind, so I'll condense my remarks as much as possible and still attempt to make this meaningful to folks. So Charlotte ably described the process to Montreal, to the second meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on Benefit Sharing for DSI. And also the way forward. I'm going to focus again very briefly on what I think are some of the results and some of the undone business from Montreal. I had the benefit of being there and watching from a distance the negotiations, and maybe I should start with just a few overall observations. As Charlotte quite rightly described it, it was the tone of the meeting. And in fact, both working group meetings on DSI has been very positive. The process is being managed by two very able co-chairs who are eternal optimists. They're very positive, they're very constructive. And I think that has actually affected everyone's approach to what are very difficult and complex negotiations. So I certainly credit the two co-chairs, but I also credit the Secretariat for managing a very open way the process. And of course, Charlotte went through the many inputs and work that have been done in support of the negotiations. So the level of awareness is really quite high amongst the negotiators. This is not that unusual, perhaps, but I think it's nevertheless quite exceptional. So in terms of the draft recommendation, including the annex on modalities for operationalizing the multilateral mechanism for fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of DSI on genetic resources, including the Global Fund. That's a mouthful. But the annex contains a good number of areas where we see convergence, where we see emerging agreement. But to be factual, to be fair, there is certainly a good number of issues that remain unresolved and that will need to be sorted out on the way to Cali, to the next COP, and perhaps afterwards. Many square brackets remain. I do not see that as a measure of lack of success. I just simply think that the understanding of where there's mutual understanding and where there's agreement and disagreement is just sharpened by the number of brackets. So again, I think the meeting was very positive. I should note that I received a phone call while I was in Montreal about halfway through the working group meeting from a large global media outlet based in New York, asking if I felt, as others had reported to the media outlet, that the meetings were not going well and there would not be a fund by the time we get through, established by the time we get out of COP16. And I was very surprised by that assertion, because in fact, being at the meeting, I could see that in fact, progress was being made, that while there were many issues to remain to be resolved, I feel, and I continue to feel, that it was an extremely constructive meeting. Right. So let me just simply say a few things about the main elements in the decision, in the draft decision. Of course, that's what we're focused on today. On triggers, the basis and modalities for benefit sharing, on non-monetary benefit sharing, funds and fund distribution and disbursement, fund host, and data governance. All of those issues categories can be split into elements on which there is potential convergence, which I mentioned, and elements on which there is need for further discussion. Next slide, please. Thank you. Triggers for benefit sharing. So where there's potential convergence, it is on the following. Commercial users should share benefits arising from the use of DSI. So commercial users should share benefits arising from the use of DSI, and that there's need for some sort of economic or social incentive for user compliance. Next. So areas under triggers for benefit sharing where we need further discussion. Very importantly is the verb issue, but in fact it's not. So you can see where the square brackets lie under the first bullet. Users of DSI are encouraged to, will, should, shall share benefits. So you can understand the degree of requirement that's described by these various competing verbs. In terms of the subject, so what are we talking about for triggers benefit sharing? Is it DSI products, services? Or is it perhaps, and there's also a question of who are the active users of DSI, and as you can see, this is an area where there's plenty of work left to be done. Basis for payment, again, there's some uncertainty there, whether the metrics are profits, revenue, turnover, sales, or product retail value. They all seem pretty similar and pretty obvious, but actually it's much more complex than I would have thought after hearing interventions and reading some of the supporting studies. Also, there's a question, maybe perhaps the basis is a percentage to be contributed. And again, you can imagine that that percentage would be certainly require plenty of negotiation and understanding about its implications. And finally, location of users to share benefits. So would it be all users in all countries or in developed countries only? Next slide, please. So for next category, non-monetary benefit sharing, certainly there's potential convergence on the following. All users, both commercial and non-commercial, should share non-monetary benefits arising from the use of DSI. I think there's little doubt that there's convergence here. Some parties underline that sharing non-monetary benefits should not make users exempt from sharing monetary benefits. So the distinction between non-monetary and monetary, while it exists, it's not. Some suggest that they're not mutually exclusive. Next slide, please. So for areas under non-monetary benefit sharing where we need some further discussion, there is the relationship between non-monetary benefit sharing and to the multilateral mechanism. I don't propose reading all of the details. You can see them for yourselves, and as Charlotte pointed out, this draft decision is available on the CBD website. It's currently an L2 document, but it'll certainly very soon be turned into a formal draft decision. And by the way, the website is cbd.int, cbd.int. Then there's a question for further discussion of obligations for users and recipients, including non-commercial users in developing countries solely as recipients of the MBS, or encouraged or expected to share non-monetary benefits as well. Next slide. Third category, fund distribution. I think there's plenty of convergence that the funds should be used for, among other things, building of DSI related capacity and realizing the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity and, of course, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that funding in the Global Fund should be allocated in a fair, equitable, transparent, accountable, and gender responsive manner. Next. So in terms of areas where we need further discussion under fund distribution, and I would not discount the degree of or the lack of convergence so far in this area, but I think there's certainly further discussions are required, and understanding needs to be improved from all sides. So this would include whether it's disbursement occurs through direct allocation to countries or through a project-based system. The idea of a formula, of course, has been raised. And while we have some potential elements for developing a formula in the enclosure from the decision at the working group, we certainly do not have convergence in my view. There is a possibility of establishing an ad hoc technical expert group or a working group for further advice and clarification on the question of formulas and allocations. Next slide, please. Fund host, plenty of convergence that it should be operated under authority and guidance, be accountable to the COP. That the funds need to be compatible with whatever system is set up under the Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework via the resource mobilization negotiations. There was a meeting of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization, which followed immediately after the closure of the DSI working group in Montreal. I haven't had a direct readout, but I do not believe that we have a conclusive result in terms of DSI from that committee meeting. This is perhaps not surprising to anyone, so there will be plenty of work to do in Cali in coordination with resource mobilization. Next slide, please. Yes, so in terms of further discussion required, big question is, will it be hosted by the Global Environment Facility, GBFF? There's concerns in this area, and there's certainly competing ideas of where the fund would be hosted, including would there be a new entity established. Next slide. So finally, in terms of last categorization of data governance, there's potential convergence on principles for data governance for existing databases. And we've also got, and let me just pull it up here. We've got in the draft recommendation, the final page, the potential decision to develop specific frameworks for sharing non-monetary benefits for specific sectors, and that there would be perhaps a request that the draft frameworks be presented to SBSTA for review at a future COP. Next. Plenty of work needs to be done, and further discussions required on the mechanics and the process of data governance. And it includes a proposal to create a CBD-run database. There's some requirement for some additional principles to be sorted out for existing databases. and of course, more work on implementation of all the principles for data governance. So it's, again, this is a work in progress, but I would say that data governance in general is making those discussions making good progress, but some major issues yet to be resolved, and the options to be fully and clearly outlined. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. Again, in summary, there's, as Charlotte said, we've had an awful lot of inputs, both on the formal side and the informal side, in terms of process and intersessional periods. Some good work done in a positive manner at 2 DSI working group meetings, and I think that bodes well for sorting things out and having a clear decision made and a way forward outlined by the time we leave Cali in November. Thanks very much. Over to you, Lily.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. I think you set us up well for the panel conversations that will come after this well-deserved break. So I would ask that you all get up, take a stretch, get some water maybe, and be back in your seats in about 6 minutes for our first panel discussion. Thank you all very much, and thank you to all of the presenters from the input presentations. I think they were enormously useful. After all of the input presentations, it's now time for our first panel, which is going to be on the scientific use of DSI. The panel is going to feature Dr. Sunil Archak and Ahmed Fatoni, and it will be facilitated again by Timothy Hodges, who you just heard from. Some notes on the panel before we start. So the first is that these panelists and all panelists that are going to speak after them are speaking on behalf of themselves rather than as representatives from their respective countries and/or institutions. And then some other quick housekeeping things. As we've been saying, please type your comments and questions in the chat and send them to everybody. We'll be collating them behind the scenes and during the question and answer period. The ABS initiative team will be posing them to the panelists to answer. For data protection reasons, you can't copy or save the chat, but an anonymized version will go in the report. And the last thing I have to say to panelists is that I have the unenviable task of serving as timekeeper. So if you see my face pop up while you're talking, that does mean that you're at time for your comment. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tim and Drs. Archak and Fatoni to start off with the first panel. You can go ahead and stop screen sharing, Ali.
Thank you very much, Lily. It's a pleasure to be rejoining the webinar to facilitate the forthcoming 3 panel discussions we've organized for our webinar. The first panel, I will introduce the panelists shortly, but perhaps I should introduce myself to begin with. For those of you just joining, my name is Tim Hodges. I'm a professor of practice in strategic global governance at McGill University in Montreal. My office is about a 15-minute walk from the CBD Secretariat. My background is in multilateral diplomacy, and I have been involved in ABS and DSI for quite a few number of years across a number of fora, including the CBD, and playing various roles, first as a negotiator and a head of delegation, then as co-chair of the Nagoya Protocol negotiations. I've facilitated a number of global webinars related to DSI, and it's really a genuine pleasure to be back doing it again. I should also say that any views or opinions that I might express those are my own and not my institution or any particular government. So with this, we'll now move to the first panel session. I do hope that our first panelists' cameras are on. And as some of you who have joined the webinar may not be familiar with all of the important faces on DSI, both from the science world and amongst the negotiators and policymakers, I would propose by introducing our first 2 panelists. First, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ahmed Fatoni. He is currently head of the Research Center for Applied Microbiology, National Research and Innovation Agency in Indonesia, where under his direction, some 165 professional staff are focusing their efforts in 3 main areas of research, namely enzyme technology, microbial technology, and fermentation. He holds a PhD from the Department of Biology and Biochemistry, the University of Bath in the UK. So good of you to join us, Tony. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sunil Archak. Sunil is a principal scientist at the Germplasm Exchange and Plant Genetic Resource Policy Unit, ICAR, National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources in New Delhi, India. I should also note he is a co-chair of the ITPGRFA, the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources, Food and Agricultural Working Group on Enhancement of the MLS, the multilateral system. He holds a PhD in plant sciences from the University of Hyderabad. Welcome, Sunil. I'm very grateful that you've been, both panelists are agreed to be with us today. You've got plenty of impressive knowledge and experience and a perspective, so thank you very much for so generously giving us your time and your views. We're going to start, as the panelists are well aware, with 3 rapid rounds of questions for which they have been prepared, and that will be followed after those responses to the questions. That will be open to, then we'll open it to questions and answers session, drawing from the comments and the questions in the chat that are being collected and monitored and collected. And as mentioned, Lily will be our will be responsible for time management. And again, if you see her face, panelists, popping up, then you know that you're reaching the end of your allotted time. So, to the panelists, your first question. And those listening might find this to be a little simplistic, but sometimes I think simple questions can elicit some crucial answers. So let's see if that's true. Question 1. From your perspective, what is the minimum you need from the MLM, the multilateral mechanism? This could, of course, be either a positive or a negative response, or it could be both. For example, I would suggest you might consider what it shouldn't have and what it might have. All right. So again, the question is, from your perspective, what is the minimum you need from the MLM? You have 2 minutes each, starting with Tony, followed by Sunil. Tony?
Okay, thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the participants. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank to the committee for inviting me here, and it's been a pleasure to participate in this kind of very important dialogue, science policy dialogue on DSI. Well, frankly speaking, first, I'd like to mention that I'm still also a bit new on this area, but been a pleasure to see the 4 presenters previously. Well, very great presentation, and yeah, I think for the minimum requirement, yeah, for the MLM, well, we already seen from the previous presenter, I guess, but in my perspective, to develop a robust multilateral mechanism for DSI, there are several key elements, I think. Yeah, the first one, I think the most important thing before we talk about DSI in more detail, we need to be in one frequency. I mean, as the previous speaker mentioned, there is a broader definition of DSI. So we need to be in one frequency, the same, we have the same perception on definition of DSI. That, I think, the key, the first one that we need to deal with, yeah, among us, yeah. And the second one, so the MLM, must be clear and simple, yeah. So this is about clarity and simplicity. So the mechanism should provide a clear guidance on how the DSI is accessed and used, and also shared. As we are aware that every country may have a similar or the same or even different regulation on how we can access DSI, use and share. That's why at the beginning we need to create the clear guidance and simple guidance how we can do this thing on DSI. And then the second one, about the equitable and benefit sharing, yeah, as we already seen before, that it must ensure that the benefit derived from any DSI are shared fairly and equitably with the countries or communities that provide genetic resources. So there must be a balance, yeah, between provider and user. How we can adjust the balance, so it depends on how we will later on negotiate. But so the benefit sharing must be shared fairly based on each contribution, maybe, yeah, and also the between provider and users. And the third one, the mechanism should be inclusive, so involving all relevant stakeholders.
Tony,
So
this
we
is
know
a
that.
this is a time check.
Okay, right. Thank you. The mechanism should include all stakeholders, so from government, researchers, industry, community. So it must be inclusive, not so the benefit can be utilized and also can be shared for everyone in a good and fair way. And the transparency, flexibility, and adaptability as well. So as we saw from the presentation, that nowadays everyone is being using AI, yeah, to design new protein. That's I don't know whether this is threat or this is our opportunity, but if we don't take care of this kind of technology, we don't adapt this kind of technology, so I think it is quite difficult for us to to catch up the use of the DSI for all of us. Yeah, but it is not we cannot hide from this kind of technology, so we must adapt. We must try to use this kind of technology to utilize our DSI. Yeah, I think, yeah, time's up. Is it? Yep.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Later we can discuss.
And my apologies to you and to all panelists for giving you such a short amount of time to respond to some rather simple but very complex questions. And next, Sunil, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, team, and thank you, organizers, for having me on the panel. At the outset, please note that researchers have been using macromolecular data on DNA, RNA, and amino acids since many, many decades for various exploratory research and then diagnostic-based investigations before we gave a fancy name, DSI. Scientists see three aspects to the multilateral mechanism: its influence on access to DSI, user-based payment mechanism and payment rates, and operation of the DSI fund. From my perspective, number one, access to DSI must remain open for all researchers, and access should never be a trigger for payment from scientists' point of view. Number two, as a researcher should know very well in advance the obligations while accessing digital sequence information from public databases, so that the multilateral mechanism can facilitate the commercial users of DSI to contribute to the fund, and all users as per the abilities to contribute to non-monetary benefits. And number three, the multilateral mechanism must ensure that the fund will be used to enhance the equity across. I just repeat this. It should be used to enhance the equity across the spectrum in terms of the ability to use DSI, and that is the capacity enhancements and collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Well, let's move to the second question. And this second question is perhaps my favorite question of the day. And it's related to fantasy and nightmares. This may sound rather dramatic, or maybe perhaps over dramatic, but they're actually serious questions. So the next question is, if you were to imagine, from your perspective, the best outcome in finalizing MLM, what would it be? What would the MLM look like? And why would you be so happy with the result? So again, the second question is about the ideal MLM from your perspective. What would it look like? What would its most important characteristics be? So Sunil, you're up first.
Okay. Look, ideally, contributors as well as recipients would like to have a multilateral mechanism with administrative simplicity, transparency, and legal certainty in its operations. I think many people, the presenters and all the participants have been stressing on this time and again. In my considered opinion, however, as a scientist, the negotiations right now are stuck at the broad options, option A, option B, like that. And then we are far from working on the nuances of issues, such as payment trigger, the exact payment triggers, payment by every sequential user in a value chain. So if I'm a scientist and I should know about that very well in advance, and then double payments across jurisdictions, say jurisdiction across countries, across sectors. So all these things must be made clear to the researchers. This is very, very essential. And then what should be the best outcome? Then I would see that the best outcome will be the one which is very simple to administer and was as well as to use by the users. And that not only ensures user-based payments in long-term predictable manner, but also establishes a dynamic working relationship with database operators, which is very, very essential. Because this MLM is only for benefit sharing and access. It doesn't work with access. So access is at the other end. So there should be a very dynamic and then live linkage between them. The multilateral mechanism, which should not, in my opinion, affect the national and regional mechanisms which are already in place. This also point has come out in an earlier version also, and I see there is a point made by a participant from Turkey on this. So there could be multiple. See, there is no single size that fits all in this. So one should be very careful about talking about this point. Use of funds for real purpose, both conservation as well as capacity enhancement to use DSI. And the last but not the least, I am a strong supporter of non-monetary benefit and non-monetary benefit sharing. Do not ignore the importance of non-monetary benefits. Because in the long term, it's always teaching how to fish is more important than giving a fish on a platter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Tony, your ideal MLM.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the ideal MLM, it's very interesting, yeah, because imagine the best outcome for this kind of mechanism for DSI. I imagine this kind of system that effectively balance accessibility, equality, and innovation. I already mentioned previously about how we can access and then equal benefit sharing. But another thing that I would like to emphasize is the ideal MLM should be able to foster the local and global collaboration to increase the utilization of our biodiversity. This is in case of DSI, and also ensuring fair benefit sharing and respect for intellectual property and also traditional knowledge. So I was imagining that the ideal MLM should be like able to, for the developing country to catch up with the advanced technology, so they can utilize the DSI to produce innovative product for their economic benefit for the local people and also the country. So I think it will be good if we can agree on the MLM where we can have a equal share benefit, and also I would like to emphasize to increase the global collaboration. So there is a transfer technology from other country to developing country or a community in local countries. Yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you very much. Well, let's go to the nightmare. And our third question, which is, what would your worst nightmare be regarding the MLM? In other words, what would cause you to wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat when you're thinking about the finalization of the MLM? So let's go to you, Tony, first for your nightmare scenario.
Nightmare scenario. Okay, imagine the worst case scenario for the finalization of this mechanism for DSI can be indeed unsettling, where we do not agree on a certain point, like how we can access freely, as Dr. Sunil mentioned. The DSI should be accessed in researcher view. It is a privilege to access the DSI freely, and because in some cases we need to pay quite a lot of money. So if there are some points, inadequate stakeholder engagement as well. So like we know that we have to include all key stakeholders in the MLM or this mechanism, but if we left some stakeholders, so there is like inadequate stakeholder engagement. So, and then also the second one, maybe the overly complex in the bureaucracy. Just to sometimes, if you want to access the data, it's quite complex, the process, and also a lot of bureaucracy that we need to go through. It's quite a nightmare as well. And then, yeah, not all can pay for the money to get the access, but so, and then the next one is the ineffective compliance and monitoring. So I heard from the presentation, we have issue on track and trace of the DSI, where the data of origin. So I think we need to have like a very good monitoring system. So if there is no monitoring system and less or ineffective compliance with the users who are accessing the data, so that will be quite a problem or challenging. And also regarding the benefit sharing mechanism, also there is an adequate benefit sharing mechanism, so like unfair distribution. So this is quite also a problem in developing countries. And failure to adapt to the technology advances, as I mentioned earlier, we have to be able to adapt with the AI technology somehow to utilize the DSI. So failure to do so, it's quite also have a big problem. And so we cannot get the benefit from the DSI. And as we know that also
This is a time check, Tony.
Yeah, when we work with other countries, there is an issue on intellectual property. So the lack of integration with intellectual property and traditional knowledge also, that will be another nightmare. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sunil?
Yeah. Policy becoming a hurdle rather than a facilitator to the research and development is feared by all scientists. And additionally, Global South getting more and more isolated, more and more technologically isolated because of these additional ones, which are perhaps maybe not properly balanced in nature. So these are the two things which give shivers. Having said that, even at ideal functionality, scientists do not expect that multilateral mechanism will raise enough funds to support the objectives of the CBD and the targets of the Global Biodiversity Plan. My worry, therefore, is the Global South believing that MLM will be a financial panacea for supporting the biodiversity conservation as well as the custodian communities. And negotiations with this assertion will fail all of us. Negotiations, let's say the scientific community see that the contributions and donations by the industry as well as the pledge by the governments are essential in addition to the user-based payments envisioned by the MLM. This is very, very important, and all of us believe this very, very firmly. Now, please don't bank on the researchers alone. Okay, last point. COP15 was a watershed moment because it brought DSI under the purview of ABS. Excellent. Every biodiversity expert, every researcher, every stakeholder wants MLM to be successfully implemented. If we fail to conclude an operational MLM or do not succeed to get consensus on key issues, which have been highlighted, flagged by you in your presentation, it may affect negatively the ongoing negotiations around DSI in other global fora as well, which in turn affecting the researchers there as well. Now, as a scientist, I'm worried that investments in bioprospecting measuring, I'm worried that solutions to climate resilient agriculture may get delayed. I'm worried that novel methods to using DSI to conserve, monitor, sustainably use biodiversity will not be available to all of us tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sunil, and thanks, Tony. You know, listening to your responses, there are a good number of things to keep you awake at night. But I think it's very valuable to talk about those issues or potential concerns openly, rather than to ignore what's keeping us awake at night. You know, and I'm aware that the Secretariat is part of this meeting and listening closely, I'm sure. And it's possible that the working group co-chairs are also listening or will be watching this discussion. I think it's the nightmare and the dream questions, fantasy questions, are actually good questions to pose to the negotiators. I think they're actually quite good. So thank you very much for that. It's very stimulating. So we have a few minutes to turn this over to Hartmut and Suel, who have been monitoring the chat, in order to provide us with some questions or observations, concerns from the chat for you, the panelists, to respond to as you will. So let's do that. There we go. Thank you.
Yes, good time of the day also from me. I'm Suhail Al-Janabi, also with the ABS Initiative. What Tim just said is that there are a lot of questions indeed to policymakers that emerge from this panel, and there are the main set of questions and the question marks I'm seeing in the chat are indeed to the policymakers panel. However, I think there are also some questions that and considerations that are important from a science perspective. So maybe let's start with one which came in quite late. I mean, we all came out of the pandemic, and so I think this consideration on the interface between a One Health approach and DSI is an important one. Also, when it comes then to being future-proof. So any views from Ahmad or from Sunil on how the DSI system should look like in terms of functioning future One Health system?
Thank you, Suel. Sunil?
Yeah.
Tony?
Yeah, although I won't be able to comment directly on the One Health system, but it's a very, very important question. Just imagine, instead of a human virus, if a virus in a similar manner attacks, let's say, wheat across globe, and we have no grain of wheat, not even a single grain of wheat harvest, what would happen? So this must encourage all the negotiators to ensure that there must be a sense of, let's say, accommodation, and then developing consensus ASAP. And all the scientists, without hesitation in terms of the collaboration. And then let's say if I know something, then I should be able to teach the other, because we do not know tomorrow which place is going to be affected by what. So this is a very important message to all of us, for negotiators to agree and then accommodate each other's opinion, and then to scientists to go further for collaborations and then capacity building programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tony, anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Dr. Sunil. The last two words I like it, collaboration and capacity building, because we have experience in the real case in 2019, how when the COVID hit Indonesia, we cannot do anything. because what the first one, we don't have the database access enough, and then also the technology itself, so we don't have the technology. So I think mastery the technology, the current technology, is very important. That's why Dr. Sunil mentioned about capacity building and global collaboration. So with the DSI database access, if we can access the database easily, and then we can collaborate in the global to, for example, to develop a vaccine together in like in one health system. So I think collaborating, this kind of collaboration will be great for us. Yeah, the DSI, the data sequence information, is the key. Yeah, how we can get the set of data or sequence is the key. Then collaboration using advanced technology is another thing to support One Health. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Suel,
maybe another one, and then Hartmut can come in. I mean, indeed, there is really no question without a policy angle in it, yeah, but which really shows the situation we are in. But now, making use of two practitioners here on the panel, I think this question, and it's a viable one. What are we doing with all the orphaned gene strings, the DSI, that are already in the INSTC, so that do not have a tag of country of origin? So what is going to be done with those? The question is, would there be made an attempt to tag them in term, or would that be brought under a common pool, like, for example, the multilateral mechanism under the treaty? So what is practical and what is unpractical in that regard from a, let's say, merely scientific and user point perspective? And I think could be also Sunil starting here, because he knows the treaty, of course, very well.
Yeah. Thank you. I think this has been discussed among many groups independently. The question from scientists is this, as follows. Now, whether we have a cutoff date, once, let's say, MLM is accepted and everybody agrees and then signed and ratified and then implemented, do we have a cutoff date on this? Okay, anything which is deposited before this, he has got no, let's say, benefit sharing or anything kind of thing. Or yes, they will have, but there will be no, let's say, because there is no metadata available. So from this, then fine, it will go to the general programs of the let's say, the proposed by the fund. So ones which are coming after that, then you have different criteria of using. So we have no idea, which is what I mentioned, that it requires little more, let's say, details and the nuances about fund flow in and out, and then cutoff dates. But it's a very, very important point for individual researchers as well as the industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Tony, anything to add?
For me, I think it's enough. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I think we have time to go to either back to Suel or Hartmut if there's anything you want to raise for the panelists. I think we may have a minute or two.
All right, then I'll continue with the scientific panel. Once again, no question without policy angle. And this is what Sunil has again alluded to already. And this is, how would you see it if there were indeed now endemic species being sequenced and uploaded in the INSTC? So it's how could one? So what are the options basically in terms of benefit sharing, multilateral and bilateral, and what would be more practical now from a user's perspective?
Thanks, Suel. We have 2 minutes, I'm told by Lily, so 1 minute each, or 2 minutes for one.
Thank you. Thank you. Quickly, yes, that's right. I'm aware that the Indian team has proposed in Montreal that we also must have an allowance for, let's say, we may not use the bilateral word for, let's say, country-specific mechanisms, if they already exist or if they propose, depending upon these specific criteria. One of which you just mentioned, and then the same point was raised by the participant from Turkey, that what if the species are endemic, and what if it's like this. We are taking it as a very simple, let's say, context. Look, the sequences are not there in the INSDC databases, and an industry or a researcher or the team comes to the country and say that, look, this is the area which we want to prospect. We want to access this and then sequence these. So they are accessing it from the point of view of sequencing. So you already know that from the step one, that this is the beginning point, and you know that they are the one which are going to be sequenced. So the country thinks, and for no bad reason, the country thinks that, oh, we should have another mechanism where we have, let's say, country-specific MOUs or mechanisms, kinds of things. So there is nothing which is developed right now. But the point is that multilateral mechanism should be the one which is overarching. Any other country-specific mechanism or region-specific mechanisms should not short-circuit the MLM, but the MLM should not, let's say, affect negatively, which is, let's say, specifically country-specific, or let's say any specific reasons are there to implement those. So these should be accommodated by the negotiators while going further, which is very important, I understand. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony?
I think I'm enough. Yeah. Yeah, no more.
Very good.
Yeah.
I think Sunil used the 2 minutes.
I apologize.
You. No, not at all. Very, very much appreciate your ideas and your experience and your willingness to address some of these difficult policy questions as well. So perhaps we can turn it around for the policymakers and some challenging science issues. So again, I very much appreciate your time and your willingness to be here. We will be asking you to turn your cameras off, but you are not going too far, because we will reconvene we will convene the two panels as the third panel. So thanks again, and see you shortly.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Right. So now we move to our second mini panel, which involves policymakers and negotiators. So we'll use the same format. We have some prepared questions that have been shared with the panelists in advance. So following introductions, we will pose the questions for a 2-minute response from each of the panelists. And then following the answers to the prepared questions, we will, as we did just now, open up questions and answers from the chat for the panelists. So that should be quite straightforward. So let me begin by introducing our panelists, and I could ensure that their cameras are on. Well, let's start with the introductions. First, I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Bilal Kutishat. He is the Director of Nature Protection Directorate at the Ministry of Environment in Amman, Jordan. And he is the national focal point for the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention to Combat Desertification, the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, Ramsar Convention, IUCN, ICRI, and IPBES. As well, he's a member of the International Advisory Committee for Biosphere Reserves. He is an engineer by training. So good of you to join us, Bilal. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to introduce. Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce Ms. Masami Fukata. Masami Fukata is Senior Negotiator for Global Environment in the Global Environment Division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo, Japan. Welcome, Masami-san.
Hello, good time of the day.
Finally, I wish to introduce Jennifer Corpus. Jennifer works for an organization called Negotiators, which works with indigenous peoples, including in Amazonia, North America and the Pacific, as well as through a interregional network to strengthen, with the purpose to strengthen guardianship of Earth and all beings. She is well known to many in her role as part of the IIFB, International Indigenous Forum Biodiversity. She is from the Cordillera region of the Philippines, indigenous person, of course, and she holds degrees in, interestingly, in both science and in law. So thank you very much for joining us, Jennifer. I believe we're in the same time zone. You at the moment in Bogota in Colombia. So good morning to you, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being willing to be part of this second panel on a very challenging and complex set of policy issues. But you're very familiar with them, as we all know, and we're looking forward to your contributions. For this second panel, as in the first panel, Lily will be acting as our strict timekeeper, so thank you for that, Lily. A reminder that to use everyone in the chat, not just a specific person, with your comments and those who are watching this meeting. So the first question for our negotiator / policymaker panelists is as follows. As you are policymakers and negotiators, from your perspective, how do we best avoid unnecessary complexity and administrative burdens in the MLM? I'm thinking of this in the implementation context of national authorities. So again, how do we best avoid unnecessary complexity and administrative burdens in the MLM in terms of implementation by national authorities? You have 2 minutes each. We'll start with Bilal, followed by Masami-san, and then Jennifer. Bilal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you very much for all. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening for my colleagues, Jennifer and Masami. We miss you after Montiel, Masami. My colleague all the time sits behind me. Maybe I think that's very important talking about that issue and about the negotiation process. We are going to have it by COP16. I think your question needs us to talk about COP16 and what we have in Montreal COP and the decisions that's still waiting, and what is the challenges we face as in coming decision. I think that's very important for us as developing countries to understand this mechanism very well and can use it for benefit and conservation of biodiversity. So because the main challenge for us to cover our commitment is financial supports and technical, I think that's very important thing. So in this regards, I think the multilateral mechanism should help us in these implementing things and back of benefits to conservation biodiversity in 2 levels, with government and local and indigenous people and local communities enhance in this progress, because conservation should be in cooperation in that levels. I think we need to see what the resource we can work on it at national level and how we can manage these things. We need to see which option we are going to have. I think we have 2 options still between brackets. Maybe for ours from our side to see, maybe option B is more support, but we have more options, and my colleague from Japan suggests other options. So we need to discuss it deeply and see how we can manage that thing. After that, I think we need to back to our countries and work on regulation framework to can be ready for that. And I trust all of us start to update and revise them and be SAP, so they will gold chance to work on these things and enhance it in MBSAP to have a good strategy and action plan to can work on this situation.
Thank you very much, Bilal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Masami-san, please, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I feel very familiar because 2 weeks ago we were in OEWG negotiating in Montreal, and Japan's seat is always between Jordan and India. So I'm very familiar even because all faces I know. For the first question, I think there is a proliferation of ABS systems already. So it is nearly nightmare, as you said in the previous session, because we have ABS system existing for plants and marine genetic resources and the pathogens, and it is increasing. I think this proliferation of ABS system create extraordinary legal complexity already. So in order to deal with this situation, I think what we need is an MLM which is flexible enough and simple and independent of Nagoya Protocol for the time being. And we discussed at OEWG about incentive. I think incentive is very important to invigorate the willingness to pay from DSI users, namely private companies. 2 weeks ago, we discussed about issuing the receipt or certificate for payment from DSI users to who contributes to global fund. I think such an incentive measure is very important to operate this MLM. And what I think most important is the avoidance of double payment and duplicative payment or multiple payment, especially between MLM and other relevant fora and between MLM and the domestic system. Otherwise, if there is duplicative payment exists, that is neither fair nor equitable, and it will discourage DSI users to contribute to the global fund. So I think these aspects are very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, over to you, please.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, so for indigenous peoples, the MLM is a part of the third objective of the CBD. And just to take a step back, the purpose of the benefits that are generated under the MLM should be to contribute to support for activities that contribute, well, activities related to conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. Now, there is ample evidence that indigenous peoples have contributed a lot to maintaining genetic diversity and biological diversity. And therefore, for us, this discussion is important. So the MLM should be simple in 2 aspects. One, in the generation of the benefits, and the second in the distribution of the benefits. So it should be as simple as possible so that the benefits that go to those that protect and maintain biological and genetic diversity doesn't get eaten up by the administrative, structure that maintains it. Therefore, it seems that a straightforward percentage of perhaps of sales or perhaps micropayments from accessing the databases for DSI could be the most workable solution to get money into the fund. And in terms of disbursing the fund, I think on the table is the idea of direct access by indigenous peoples to the benefits, as well as a project-based approach with a certain percentage similar to the GBF fund dedicated to indigenous peoples. In the GBF fund, it's 20% programmatic. So I think making that connection between the benefits and the activities that conserve biodiversity and sustainably use biodiversity would be ideal. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for very, very clear responses. I think it's a very interesting first round, and I appreciate your clear thinking. So let's go to the second simple question. And it is as follows. And it certainly builds on what you've said already, in my view. So from your perspective, how can we ensure that benefits are shared at substantial scale to support conservation and sustainable use through the MLM and its fund? So again, how can we ensure that benefits are shared at substantial scale to support conservation and sustainable use through the MLM and its fund. We'll begin with you, Masami-san, and then Jennifer will follow, and Bilal will will be in third place this time. Please, Masami-san.
Okay, thank you very much for your second question. This DSI Global Fund is still a new fund, so it is important to keep its credibility. In order to have the credibility of DSI Global Fund, I think transparency and accountability is the key. And we almost agreed on the importance of transparency during OEWG, because if we need to make sure where the money goes from the perspective of DSI users, if where they are paying must be clear enough, otherwise they will be accused by their shareholders and they will be criticized by other stakeholders. So I think transparency, accountability is very important to secure the enough funding for this DSI fund. I also think involvement of wide-ranging stakeholders as much as possible, not only from DSI users, but non-DSI users should be able to pay if they wish, in order to have wide-ranging base to collect money to DSI Global Fund. I also think it is important to have this MLM flexible enough, because we don't know how it goes, how it operates. We need to run this mechanism for a time being for several years. And if necessary, we have to review and monitor. And if necessary, amend the system. So this system must be something fixable. That is my opinion. So this flexibility and wide-ranging stakeholder, wide-ranging base to collect money from all sources, I think it's very important. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think what's attractive about the MLM, the proposed MLM for indigenous peoples, is that, you know, with the traditional Nagoya Protocol model, most of the burden for regulation and for negotiations of mutually agreed terms fall on the government. And in our experience, the indigenous peoples that also steward the resources are frequently overlooked. And so the MLM is quite attractive. And, you know, I think the theory behind the Nagoya Protocol holds true for the MLM as well. Those that generate the most, you know, the most value from uses of DSI on genetic resources should be paying the most. And so, you know, it seems that a percentage, you know, capturing a percentage of the value generated from, you know, blockbuster drugs, cosmetics, and so forth makes logical sense. And so, yeah, and then, of course, you have other uses of DSI, and their uses could be non-commercial. Nonetheless, their work benefits a lot from uses of DSI related to GRs. And so there has to be a system also to capture, you know, because they have benefited, they should also share, you know, part of the benefits that they derive from the use of DSI. Yeah, and in that way, we make sure that a substantial amount goes into the multilateral fund. And then in terms of, you know, governance of the fund, it seems important, I think, for the CBD itself to play a role in the governance of the system itself. And then, and as is currently on the table, indigenous peoples need to be part of it, mainly for the data governance, but also transparency in terms of where the genetic resource that the DSI is derived from comes from. If it's something that's culturally important to indigenous peoples, if it's something that's found in indigenous peoples' territory, it would be important for us to know that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Bilal, please. Last but not least.
Thank you very much, Tim. Here, for me, it is very important to take care about critical points. The first one, we know that digital sequence and form is divided from genetic resources, but it is not equal in definition and not like genetic resources. And genetic resources, we work it under Nagoya Protocol, so we have governance and clear procedure for genetic resources and how we can work under genetic resources from big to mat, and how the process going in negotiating with government and ABCs, etc. For all that, it is clear. So in genetic resources or access to genetic resources, it is not MLM, it is bilateral system. So here it is different, and this is right for parties. But in DSI, so here, because we have some problem in treasury and monitoring the sequencing and like it, we are going to a multilateral mechanism. I think it is a new fund, as what Mr. said, and it is very important to can work on it by smart way. The main things we need to have from this process to create equity, not equity, because that's what we need now. Many of benefits is sharing, but it is not under equity between. But this is what we need to focus on it now. I think very important issue to negotiate in the process and mechanism of how this fund should be work. The steps we are going to work on it, and the type of distribution of the benefits. This is, I think this is very important, and we should in this case respect the regulations or the governance work with parties they have on the national system. I think this is very important to take care, and we should respect the rights under Nagoya Protocol. Now we need to have this equation to see this multilateral mechanism is for a new technology coming from genetic resources. Need to have good benefit from it, and need to back these to conservation in two levels between government and ABCs. I think this what we need to think about it, and we need to review our mechanism, how it is working on land, to make sure it is going in benefits and an effectiveness of need or to implementing the conservation of biodiversity. So in this case, I think many important to have a clear procedure, clear regulations, clear steps, how we can manage this multilateral mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bilal. Thank you to all of you. We're going to benefit from your presence here today by opening up to questions and answers posed through my colleagues to you. So please don't go anywhere. I'm going to move it over to Suel and Hartmut. What have you got for us, Suel? Hartmut?
Yes, now it's me posing the questions.
Good.
So we share the work. Yes, well, I think one of the let's say basic questions in the chats also relates to actually the relationship between the bilateral and the multilateral systems. How would the multilateral system affect the bilateral system, if at all? Because I think that is a main concern of a lot of parties we heard at the negotiations. So if you could just go into that. And sorry, my internet connection is pretty weak here, but we will manage.
Thank you very much, Hartmut, for persevering. A good question in my mind. Do we have anyone willing to take this on?
I'll take a first crack.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah. Well, I think that well, just because we have a multilateral mechanism doesn't mean that that the Nagoya Protocol ceases to exist, because for access that's based on the model of physical access to genetic resources, indigenous peoples believe that the Nagoya Protocol and the bilateral system should still continue to apply. Furthermore, when it comes to traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources, there should always be access rules applying whenever traditional knowledge is accessed. And I think that's part of Decision 15/9. So, you know, of course, we acknowledge that many of the genetic resources are already sequenced and are in databases, and scientists will make choices. So if it's easier to access through the DSI, through a DSI database, then that's a choice they make. However, if something is not yet in the system, then, you know, and we believe that it's possible for both systems to coexist. Thanks.
Thank you. Bilal, I believe you would like to speak.
Yes, this is a very important question because I think we're talking about it last meeting in Montreal, especially in enclosure E. Here it is very important when you are going to make access on physical genetic resources and you want to use only this gene linked with this tradition and knowledge. Here you are going to follow the process you have under Nagoya Protocol, which is clear. And in some cases, you should have here only not bilateral by company and one country or one party. Maybe many parties in the same region share the same knowledge and the same genetic resources. So here the equation is related to physical issue, but in digital sequence you use as digital and you don't know sometimes what that sequence related to what and related to which party and related to which gene. So by this way you cannot have tracing and monitoring for this sequencing from where and etc. So this is wide uses of these genetic resources. This is the difference between multilateral mechanism and bilateral mechanism. You going as for example, I am going to buy a shirt. Okay, I am going to buy this shirt and I wanted Adidas. So I going to Adidas shop directly. But any shirt, the all market is open for me, so I need to go everywhere. So this is and these things are going to make this bilateral between, for example, Adidas company directly by physical by this criteria. But in whole system you have many options as copy or original one, etc. So you have diversity, and you don't know. Sometimes you cannot make sure this is original or it is a copy. So here is you cannot talk about yes, I think it is as best. Okay, this is between bilateral and multilateral. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very
Okay.
much. Masami-san.
Thank you. As Jennifer and Bilal said, I think Nagoya Protocol system should stay as it is. It should continue. Because it as track and trace of DSI is impractical as written, as decided by 15/9. The bilateral system for DSI is quite difficult. And that is why we decided to establish multilateral MLM for DSI. But I know there are some voices from private companies. It is easier for them to have it all together for the DSI and genetic resources, everything under multilateral mechanism. I can see their point, but again, it is still too early because we don't know how this MLM will work. So for the time being, I think bilateral is for genetic resources and multilateral is for DSI, which is not material. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, again, a very good question, some very clear responses. Thank you. All right, back to my colleagues for our next question, please.
All right, it's me now. And with the hour of the day, we are increasing also the level of complexity. So there's no lack of. I would like to combine two questions because they're very much related. So there is this question on the governance of current free and open access to DSI databases. So how this is going to be maintained, and also whether then this governance would be established under the CBD norms and processes, or would it be a completely standalone mechanism? I think these are really two very much related questions, because, of course, for the time being, access to DSI in the INSDC relates then to sequence informations which are deriving from genetic resources that are governed under very different fora. So this is now the question. So how can we maintain this current free and open access, this governance scheme, and would then this be under CBD norms only, or would it be something standalone that also then would include access to and benefit sharing in relation to the other international fora, such as treaty, such as BBNJ, such as the WHO?
Thank you, Suel. Yes, it's getting more complicated. Thank you for that. Well, someone will want to go first, I'm sure. If not, it'll be my opinion. Who would like to go first? Sami-san, please.
I just wonder, is this the governance of database, not the fund? I think the questions about the governance of a database. 2 weeks ago in Montreal, we had a discussion about this governance of database, and that is paragraph 9, I remember, of L2 document, and there was a lot of requirement for database operators. But we think it is too much for small operators. Large database operators, they have some coordinator who might be able to do that, but some small database operators, it is too much for them. And there was a proposal to have a database under the CBD Secretariat. I don't think it is quite difficult for a treaty secretariat to run a database. So that is my opinion. The governance of database, I think all these requirements should be for large operators only. And I also think these database operators should be exempted from the making monetary contribution to the global fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello?
Yes, I think the database is very important issue. I need to be engaged with it. Especially, we need to create a system, and this system should be effectiveness. So how can I make this monitoring without we didn't know what the process going on and what the data I have to use it to can get these benefits. So I think that's proposal did from our colleague from Egypt to see how we can make governance on database, and we have under CBD experience about this database, like what happened on biosafety. So we think can work unlike this database and have this monitoring and see what we can do. I think it is flexible to have these things, but need to more work and be more clear on that system. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, Jennifer.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, there would be a single system that covers everything, no? WHO, BBNJ, treaty, and CBD. However, I don't, the negotiations required to arrive at that system will take some time. And I think that the biodiversity crisis is urgent, and we need, really to fulfill the promise of the third objective of the CBD. Therefore, initially, as an initial proposal, it will need to be under the CBD at the moment. And, I think there's a difference between maintaining a database and the database being under the authority, or the MLM being under the authority of the CBD. And I think it's important that the system itself is under the authority of the CBD. Yeah, but then, of course, there are multiple databases that would need to be brought under a single umbrella. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we have, yes, we have a few more minutes if we have at least one more question.
Yeah, I could get to the policy panel with a question that has already been posed to the scientific panel, and because I think we also need your view on this. And this is indeed now the question on the DSI that are already in public databases where the country of origin is unknown. So there were these considerations of cutoff dates in relation to these to this information, or whether it should be all dealt as one, new ones and older ones in terms of benefit sharing. So what's the way forward on the DSI that are already in the public databases? Country of origin is unknown. We know this is the bulk of the DSI. Is there anything to do with those, or would they be the pure example of dealing under a multilateral umbrella with those resources?
Thank you, Suel. Another good question. Do we have any views or ideas? Yes, please, Ms. Ami-san.
I think there are old DSI in the database which sometimes acquired decades ago. But if we trace all these old DSI in database, there will be endless. So just for simple reason, I think there should be no retrospective application of DSI on this database. That's very my simple idea.
So no retroactivity, Jennifer?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Yeah, because it depends on the purpose, right, of including the metadata. And if we are not thinking about tracking and tracing, which we have determined in Decision 15.9 as something that would be impractical, then perhaps there is no need to go back to the sequences that are already deposited in the data. What matters is that it's clear that whenever these sequences are accessed, then it would trigger a benefit sharing requirement. However, having said that, there is also a framework developed by the CBD for repatriation of information. And as long as the purpose is to enhance transparency for indigenous peoples, it would be very important for us to be able to tag some of the sequences already in databases that come from our territories and that are very clearly related to our cultural and spiritual practices. And more importantly, also those that were discovered through leads that were discovered through traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. And that would be for transparency purposes only, not really for tracking and tracing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So I think we have 2 minutes left. Do we have time for one more round?
Yeah, maybe a quick one of an issue I'm not aware of that it has been discussed or negotiated, but it's an interesting angle, of course. And this is that genetic materials do not only bring benefits, but also damages, right? So there's a question out there whether within the negotiations also compensation to damages have been considered, and the references made to pathogens and invading species. So maybe we could provide an answer on that.
Well, that's interesting. I certainly don't recall reference to damages, but I'm not always awake during the negotiations, I have to confess. So perhaps our negotiators can recall or have an idea or response, whether it's been talked about or not. Maybe you've got some thoughts about it. Anyone?
I
Yes,
think
please.
we are discussing formula. During the contact group, we talked about biodiversity richness. but together with biodiversity richness, well, these are the criteria to be incorporated into formula. We also briefly discussed about the threats and risk to biodiversity, but that's about it. We really didn't discuss deeply the compensation for damage.
Thank you. I think that ends this this round. I very much appreciate all three of you, your openness, your willingness to tackle some difficult questions and areas. Very much appreciate it. Thank you. I'm going to revert to Lily, and I believe that we may be having a break. I certainly hope so. I think we deserve it, don't you, Lily?
Yes, I agree, Tim. Please take this as your sign to take 5 minutes and get up and stretch and get some water. And then we'll be back with Tim and all of the panelists from whom you've already heard for our third and final panel. So see you in 5 minutes. Just waiting for Ahmed Fatoni to turn his camera on. But Tim, you should feel free to start introducing the third panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lily. I certainly do not need to introduce the panelists themselves. By now, they're well known to you. And let's get started then. Thanks to those panelists for rejoining us. You only have one question that I'm going to pose to you, and then we're actually going to open it up. So this last panel session will really be principally you, the panelists, interacting with the registrants, with people watching, and people on the chat via my colleagues, Sue Ellen Hartwood. So here we go. This is a bit of a warm-up question. From your perspective, on which topics could future national level dialogues, so future national level dialogues between policymakers and users support implementation of the MLM? So what sorts of dialogues and what topics would be usefully discussed between the policymakers and the user communities, science communities to support the implementation of the MLM? So I'm asking you to reflect on implementation. And of course, negotiators typically are not responsible directly for implementation of the treaties and the decisions that they negotiate on behalf of their governments. But increasingly, it's recognized that implementation is key to success, not just simply adoption of a decision. So this is a very concrete question to all of you. So let's give you 2 minutes each for those who would like to respond. There's no obligation to, of course, but we certainly very much welcome your thoughts on this. Anyone? Yes, please, Sunil, we'll start with you, just because I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you for this question. I think this is very important, but it is depending on results coming after COP16. So I think the main things we need to have negotiated at national level is if you want, we are preparing for COP now, so we can discuss with colleagues for which option is valid for us and which can retain on best benefit for us and the process, etc. So after COP, we need to initiate how we can ready to work on this decision after COP, and what regulation we need and what the preparation we need, and to cover all gaps we have in field to can make sure the implementation is under effectiveness road. So it is your question. It is depending on 2 ways. First things to preparation for COP and see what the best of national level, and that should reflect to regional consultation and regional group meetings. Then you need after decision work on decision you have.
Thank you very much, Bilal. Anyone else? Oh,
Yeah, may I?
yes,
Tim?
please.
Thank you.
Please.
There are a couple of questions. Let's say, when genetic resources were used in a traditional manner, there were a set of labs that were doing that one. There were a set of field experiments and then laboratories that were carrying out those kinds of experiments. And later, subsequent to CBD, we established a regulatory system in countries, and then the protocols were established, the procedures were established, fund was established, and then people knew that this is how it could be implemented. Now, suddenly we have a different set of laboratories, the molecular genetics laboratories, the sequencing laboratories, the genomics laboratories, a different set of people. There might be few who are common, but there are a different set of people, a new generation of people who are carrying out access and use of DSI, but you want the same set of regulatory setup of the country to implement the similar thing now, because you won't be having a new organization, a new thing for implementing these kinds of setups. So it's very important for all of us, the scientists as well as the negotiators, to internalize that these are inherent challenges, that the same set of regulators and administrators will have to now look at the access and benefit sharing and then intricacies of these sequence-based and then DSI kind of things. This is one point. Now, the second point is about the actual fund, because there were options in the text here that what kind of way that the payment is routed through, whether you are going to have is it going to be individually the industry or the individuals going to pay directly to the DSI fund, or it is going to be routed through a country fund, or what are the different options? So are we going to generate, build a new fund, the one which you already have a biodiversity fund or a national fund? You also have a DSI fund nationally. So what kind of mechanisms you would like to visualize? So these kinds of dialogues are essential, because without these kinds of discussions and handholding, all the countries will not be able to follow a similar set of, let's say, a canonical package, which is essential for us to move forward, let's say in a straightforward, or let's say in a quick manner. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. Next, Jennifer, please, and then Ms. Hami.
Yeah, thanks. I think the character of the dialogue at national level will change based on whether the system that we decide on is going to be a mandatory system or a voluntary system. But in any case, I will interpret your question, although it doesn't mention indigenous peoples and local communities, to also include the possibility of having the dialogue include indigenous peoples and local communities. I think it's very important to have discussions between users, policymakers, and indigenous peoples in order to identify at the national level what extent indigenous peoples and local communities steward genetic resources. There is always this global figure that's cited. 40% of indigenous territories, for example, overlap with key biodiversity areas. 80% of biodiversity can be found in indigenous territories, and so forth. But that has to be pieced out at the national level. So, for example, in the Philippines, according to a World Bank study, it's 94% of genetic resources that can be found in ancestral domains of indigenous peoples. So we need to look at that, and indigenous peoples will need to be able to express, for instance, which resources represent culturally and spiritually significant. Which ones are culturally or spiritually significant for indigenous peoples, what the rules are in relation to traditional knowledge, and other worldviews of indigenous peoples, which may not be immediately apparent when you talk about DSI. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Listen.
Thank you. What kind of administrative measures or policy measures we are going to take after COP? I think everything should go towards the conservation of biodiversity. That is the ultimate objective of this treaty. It seems to be forgotten in all this confusion, all this discussion, and that very basic objective, that conservation of biodiversity, it's sometimes forgotten. We sometimes find ourselves only talking about specifics, too technical. Of course, technical stuff is important, and what kind of regulation, what kind of measure needed is also important, but everything must be going towards the conservation of biodiversity. That is what why we are here for. And I just want to, if we have a national dialogue, because many private companies still do not know the use of DSI contributes to the conservation of biodiversity. This issue is not quite well known yet, different from climate change. The system mechanism of biodiversity loss and risk is not quite well known yet. So that is what we are trying to achieve nationally. So the importance of course, certain money is needed. That is why we need this fund. But what we need to head for is the conservation of biodiversity, that importance, mainstreaming of biodiversity, that kind of overall objective and ultimate objective is what we need now, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Okay, yeah.
Please, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. So assuming that after the COP, we are going to implement this MLM. So I think the first one should be to make sure that the policymakers and all users have a clear understanding of the same and clear understanding of the LMM guidelines and requirements, and also how they apply at the national level. So we should have a clear about it. I think that's should be the first topic when we want to apply this MLM. And then the second one, we need to discuss with our nation at the national level how the laws and regulation in our nation can be aligned with the MLM to ensure the implementation and compliance, and also how the MLM can be integrated with the existing national, because maybe at the national level we need to modify our regulation or other laws regarding the MLM implementation. And then, yeah, I agree with the previous panelists that discussing with our local and local communities and indigenous people, just to make sure that they also get their right, yeah, from the DSI or from the genetic sources that they provide to us. And another topic about the capacity building and support in the implementing national, like a national training program to build capacity among users, researchers, institutions, and also government. And as a researcher, I'd like to discuss more on how we can promote innovation and collaboration in national and international research, because we as a developing country, we need to catch up with the developed countries, how we can utilize our genetic resources and then also conserve them. And the last one, maybe we need to have like this meeting right now, international coordination, because every country may have a different experience and also different challenges. So that's why coordinating with other countries, like what we have now, international bodies, to ensure that the implementation of LMN is beneficial for all stakeholders, and also we can have like exchange best practices and lesson from national implementation from other countries. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you, everyone. Your last remark reminds me that very, very few examples exist multilaterally of and there's some important exceptions, but there aren't that many examples of this a built-in learning mechanism amongst countries in terms of implementation. I think like many of the ideas that you've raised, they're very interesting and actually can actually be they could easily be established. So thank you, everyone. What we're going to do now is open up the questions and answers, and it's my prerogative to do this, and the team will support it. Rather than simply using the chat to acquire questions and comments for you, the panelists. What we were going to do now is enable participants, registrants, to, in fact, speak. So raise their questions with you. While the registrants, are thinking about us, I think we may have one question ready to go anyway from the existing sets of interventions in the chat. Perhaps Sewell, we can go to you for that.
Yes, sure. And of course, it draws back to something that has already been alluded to, which is this question on bilateral and multilateral, this interface. And it's a very practical one, and Sunil was involved on that. There seems to be really a fear and questions with regards to what is to do if I do access the genetic resource under a bilateral system with pick and mud, and I do have benefit sharing obligations. And I, of course, comply to those. I would pay and contribute. And then I'm sequencing it. I'm uploading it as a commercial user, and would then be either fall under the sectorial approach or as an individual company to share benefits. So this seems to occur like a potential double payment trap. Question is, how could that be avoided? Because that seems to be a very, very practical concern by many.
Thank you, Sewell. Yes, I've heard that concern voiced as well. So to our illustrious panelists, how would you respond? How would you address this? Or do you need more time to think of it? Oh, please, Sunil.
Yeah, because it was my question. I wouldn't rather respond, but I will just add another layer to that. This was raised earlier also, that the payment obligations across different global instruments.
Yeah.
Let's specific company accesses DSI of, let us say, some plant species that are covered under International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And then they can use these sequences for purpose of food and agriculture that are restricted. The use there in the treaty is restricted for only food and agriculture, and the DSI are used there. And they also use these same set of DSI in their another, because they have multiple franchises, multiple, let's say, business interests. Also use the same thing for, let's say, some medicinal purposes using pharmaceuticals, same set of DSI. Now, do they have to pay in both the places? So these are multiple cases of obligations or possible obligations of double payments. So these are indeed tricky questions and then require discussion at length. Thank you. I have not given any response, but added.
To the piling on the staple of open questions, indeed.
I think we have a few more responses from the panelists. Jennifer, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick reflection, and it's in relation to the taxes that I pay every month. And, you know, I pay taxes, many different taxes, and for different purposes, no? So when you access, I think that's well, probably for a different purpose. When you commercialize, it's for a different purpose and so forth. And it's in the same way when I buy things at the grocery, I would pay value-added tax. I pay income tax, I would pay business tax, and so forth. So this is not actually a foreign concept as long as we keep it to a manageable amount, I think. Then I don't see problems with multiple payments.
Thank you, Jennifer. Bilal, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you, Tim. I think here we need to understand this issue. First things, if you are going to use genetic resources as in physical phase, here you are going to work on it as you have high knowledge about these genetic resources. So here you are commitment for PIC with parties. So here I think you need to use this knowledge, these genetic resources as it. But in DSI, you work in innovation and research. So you don't know if that's right or no, or you try to make test about that. So here you have open access. So now you have different things, and the other things is very important. I think some cases you are going to use these genetic resources, but sometimes you need to have catalyst for your work. So I think this is different way. You're going to share benefits from trigger genetic resource or sequencing, but sometimes you take the genetic resources as a trigger and you know some catalyst. So you are using last catalyst from the sequencing. Here you have different things. You have bilateral and you have multilateral, because you don't think this is give you a real good way. So maybe my colleague as specialist or a scientific can correct me or know as I am right or no. Here I am going to use this knowledge depending related to the genetic resources, and I want to test if it is real, it is effective, I need it. So here I don't need only to test what the various uses. Here I am just going to test these uses. If it is good and it is right knowledge and it is going right, so this is how benefit should be back to owner. But in the sequencing, you work all time in research and innovation. For that, we keep open access for digital sequence to can support innovation and research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Well, we'll see if we got some further questions from those on the line. But while we're waiting to do that, I have a question for you. It wasn't prepared. I hadn't prepared it, but and excuse my ignorance if I'm a bit too simplistic or unaware. But Masami-san, you did mention small databases, but I can't recall where we're at in the discussion about private databases versus public databases. Has there been much discussion? I mean, I know there's a distinction. I kind of know what they are, those distinctions are, but has there been, do we have many views on how or if to deal with private databases? Because I have heard the concern that that people will go towards private if the public system is not efficient, transparent, etc. Masami-san, have you something to say on this?
Yes, during OEWG, I think we mainly discussed about public database, and the issue about private database was not quite heavily discussed. But what I hear from my database colleagues is that there are many small databases connected to INSDC, and some databases are run by only 2 or 3 people. So all these requirements in L2 document, paragraph 9, is very heavy on them. So I think this paragraph, it doesn't say public or private database. It just says database. That is my concern came out like that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Right. So we will now ask you if you have anything to share, dear panelists, to do it now, please. And then I'm going to thank you all. But please feel free. You have the floor. Sunil, please.
Thank you for this opportunity. I made a mention of country-specific mechanism. This particular observation or intervention may not be welcomed by everybody. because this right now we are actually in the nascent stages of thinking about multilateral mechanism. So this may, let's say, hinder that kind of thing because we are yet to achieve some kind of thing. But the point is, there are 3-4 points. Number one, what if a specific indigenous technical knowledge based on the specific region of the country and specific communities there, okay, and then based on that kind of knowledge, you are accessing the material as well as the sequences now. Your success in having sequence or using those sequences commercially is almost entirely dependent upon the fundamental knowledge that was already existent. Now, in such cases, you are already aware firsthand that it is specific to this country, this community. So you have to respect some of these specific conditions. So the point is that you have to give opportunity to understand different contexts of accessing the sequences rather than thinking that, okay, we have a database somewhere else and then anybody can just go and access and this is how you have to pay. No, it's not like that. People access only sequence, people access sequence plus material, people access material, then generate sequence and then submit, somebody else will access. People access sequence and then indigenous technical knowledge. So my request is that make things as simple as possible for scientists, as well as let's say the implementing agency. The simple, I think since morning we have heard this simple and then simple word multiple times. This is the thing that will lead to compliance. If you want compliance, make it simple. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. And it reminds me that I could ask the panelists before you go that you fill in the evaluation. You'll know what I mean. And if you don't know what I mean, ask me. Jennifer, please, for some final remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. And I think the information shared was really good. And the opportunities provided for the representatives of different sectors is very much welcome. I think these dialogues are very much needed. And, it's always, I think, worth it to remind everyone that we are in a crisis, biodiversity crisis. And when one of my colleagues at the IIFP conducted a study, she is a scientist herself, and she conducted a study asking users of DSI and genetic resources about their willingness to pay. And it seems that those with the awareness of this crisis, are very much willing to pay. And so I think we should harness that goodwill from among the users, researchers, scientists, and so forth, and just finalize and operationalize this multilateral mechanism, because the crisis is big. We really need to be supporting those that conserve and sustainably use biodiversity. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I rarely comment on comments, but I have increasingly heard, including today, but in the margins of DSI meeting and at CBD meetings, including from industry now, which I didn't hear 10 years ago, the word crisis, biodiversity crisis, and awareness of that. So it is a very compelling situation and urgent situation. I think we would all agree. Thank you very much. And again, for everyone on the line, there will be an evaluation form up before the end of this webinar, and we urge you to fill it out candidly. Thank you so much. This has been, I've learned a lot. I think I'm a bit clearer on some issues as well. I very much appreciate, as I said already, your time and your willingness to be so open and so forthcoming. I know on behalf of everyone on this call that you've done an outstanding job on a very difficult sets of issues, answering concretely as you could. So once again, I appreciate it very much. And to turn it back to Lily. Lily, please.
Thank you, Tim. And panelists, you can feel free to turn off your cameras. I want to echo Tim's sentiments and thank you all, both the panelists and the participants, for making time to be here with us today. We certainly all learned a lot from each other, and I think that sort of preempting the conversations on the way to COP16 will continue to be useful. So I guess I'll leave you with one statement, which is I urge you to take what you heard today and to bring it back to your national contexts, whether that's with users, whether that's with colleagues in other ministries. Think about what you heard today and share it widely. I will now turn it over to my colleague Suhail Al-Janabi for some closing remarks, and then we'll let you all go to your days. Suhail, over to you.
Well, thanks, Lily, and thanks all the panelists. Thank you, Tim, also for your very capable moderation of the panels, and also the participants for their very viable and difficult questions, as we saw. And not all questions have been answered. Further questions have been added by the panelists, and rightly so. But that shows me really that no one has the entire wisdom and knowledge to develop such a multilateral mechanism on its own. So there is a need for dialogue. There's a need for dialogue between, as we tried today, policymakers and scientists, but of course, also with the colleagues that are dealing with the other fora, with the treaty, with BBNJ, with the WHA colleagues, for example. So I would really, really encourage you for within the remaining weeks until COP16 to make use of the time to exchange with your colleagues nationally, regionally, on all these open things, or at least those that you find most burning. And I think it was quite useful to think also in scenarios. So not only theoretically, but this, what would happen if, and this is where I think we really need this exchange with the users, with the commercial users, with the non-commercial users, because for them, of course, these scenarios are day-to-day business. And from the initiatives end, we are trying together with Meridian to foster these dialogues. We will have one further stepping stone between now and the COP, and that's informal dialogue between users and negotiators in the first place, each on its own, but then also exchanging on the outcomes from Montreal on the way to Cali in the week from 16th to 20th of September in South Africa. So the invitations have been sent out. And that we'll hope that some further thinking, particularly on these scenarios, can emerge, and also solutions can be found, which we would then present in a report, and then disseminate upfront before COP with the negotiators and other stakeholders as a piece of information. So, as we heard, a lot needs to be still discussed and negotiated, and compromise to be found at COP in Cali, and keep our fingers crossed that for the sake of compromise, things will not be watered down, that it's going to be something that delivers to biodiversity conservation, to IPLCs, maintains open access, will be contributing to shared equitable sharing, and all the other criteria that have been mentioned by the Secretariat that we find in decision 15/9. So thanks again to all of you, and please don't forget to also fill the evaluation form when you log out, and yes, at the latest, hopefully see you at COP. Have a great day.